Welcome to Timeout Tech, powered by Coliseum Sport, featuring hosts Andrew Wilf, Jake Radis, and Will Silverman.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the inaugural episode of our podcast, Timeout Tech, powered by Coliseum Sport. On the menu for today, we will discuss the evolution of soccer, specifically with respect to the role of VAR. Later in the episode, we'll have the absolute honor and privilege of bringing on CEO of U.S. Club Soccer and former CEO and general manager of DC United, Mr. Kevin Payne. After that, we'll jump right into our startup of the week, Soccer Dream. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Jake, Andrew, what are your thoughts on VAR, and how do you think it's advancing soccer?
It's a loaded question. I'm so excited to hear from Kevin Payne later in the episode because, he's an old school guy trying to integrate VAR in soccer. Really exciting, but when I watch soccer nowadays, my favorite team, Manchester City, when they have a little offsides, I'm now scared, something that, maybe you can play off by a human, now you can't with a computer. We're going to talk about that in the boiler room, but, Jake, what are your thoughts on VAR?
I don't know. I love VAR. I think it's great for the sport, but at the same time, I don't know. I think it's just doing a little too much for the sport. I just like the simplicity of soccer. I like how it's just the man, the ball, and the field, and I think that VAR, it kind of ruins it a little bit, but I don't know. We'll get more into it in a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Well, as Andrew started to say, one of our segments that you guys will get more and more used to as we have more and more episodes is Boiler Room Takes, where we like to deliver a hot take, kind of get the conversation going. So going off of that, I'm gonna give our first Boiler Room Take. I honestly think that VAR is really only needed in about the last 10 minutes of the game. My biggest issue right now with VAR is honestly how accurately it's being used. And I know that sounds kind of weird to say, but to me, when I think about rules, when I think about why rules are implemented, they're implemented for the purpose of ensuring that a player doesn't gain an unfair advantage. And for me, a big issue with VAR right now is players are being reviewed for offsides, and they're being called offsides by the 10th of a millimeter. Now, when a player is offsides by a 10th of a millimeter, to me, that's not an unfair advantage. And I get the counter argument. In other sports, in basketball, in baseball, if a ball is outside of the strike zone by a millimeter of an inch, it should be a ball. If a player steps on the baseline or an end line by a millimeter of an inch, they are out. But for me, those aren't really enforced, not really in baseball, but more in basketball, until the last 2 minutes. In basketball, when you're 30 seconds into the game and someone's off or someone's out of bounds by a millimeter of an inch, that's not really worried about. You're 10 seconds into the game, it's a millimeter of an inch. With 2 minutes left in a crunch time play, sure, I get it. So I think that can be applied to soccer. I get it. There are goals that are being reviewed. It is more significant than a player specifically stepping out. But when we're 2 minutes into the game and a player is offsides by the skin of his teeth, I don't need that to be reviewed for 7 minutes on a 1-0 goal. Maybe if there's 3 minutes left and we're about to be at full time and it's 3-2 and the match is hanging in the balance and someone is offsides by that little of a margin, well then at that point it is necessary to go to VAR and to have it that extensively reviewed. And while I understand, yes, every goal is equally important. I get that the goal in the first 10 minutes is as important as the goal in the last minute. For me, it's just about the effect it's having on the game. There's no need 2 minutes into a game to stop the whole game, review, see if someone's offsides by a 10th of an inch. With 2 minutes left, I understand, but for me, the way it's being implemented right now is almost too extensive.
I think it needs to be extensive, and that's where I'm going to disagree with you. I think if you just put it to the last 10 minutes, say it's a 3-0 game, and there could have been, an arguable call earlier in the game that VAR could have helped out with, but now it's 3-0, the game is over. Last 10 minutes is good maybe for a situation where it's competitive, but then you have different, situations when it's 3-1, 3-0 with 10 minutes left, the game is over. 10 minutes left, VAR will work if it's 1-1. But I think you need to keep it as is because that's where consistency happens. What needs to happen is maybe they can change the rule where it's not an inch, maybe it's 3 inches. So it's not using a little, like one's finger to see if someone's offsides, because that ruins the sport to me. The part of sports is, lying acting, flopping. That's what sports is, kind of being an entertainer, especially professional sports. Jake, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you just touched on the point about consistency, and I mean, if you look at like American football, the NBA, the MLB, and now with soccer and VAR, there's a consistency among all the sports that they go down to the exact needle point to make sure that players inbounds or out of bounds. So I think in terms of there being leeway, I think that goes away from the whole point of replay. Like in the NBA, when there's like, let's say there's like 12 minutes left in the quarter. I mean, fourth quarter, game 7 of the finals, and LeBron gets it, steps on the baseline, and you want to look at it. I think that even if he's on the, like, we've seen it, like, even if he's like this much on the baseline, like, it's still out. Like, I think that it needs to stay. I think the exact point of being offsides needs to stay because it's consistent among all sports.
And I think that's the way professional sports is. You look at the NFL; they have new rules every year. This is what all professional soccer needs to do. They need to ramify it a bit. They need to change it a bit because it's really good. It just seems a little raw and not like polished yet.
And that's the point of a professional sport. The professional athletes are the most perfect they're the most perfect breed of athlete.
Yeah,
and they should be held to those standards.
So, hearing everything you guys said, I'm actually going to revise my take, and I actually like the new statement that I have a lot better. In almost all sports outside of soccer, coaches' challenges are a pretty big thing, and I think a perfect way to kind of fix this issue of not being consistent or when should we implement it, how perfect are we being, is we should only go to VAR from a coach's challenge.
How many challenges do you get a game?
I think you could do one challenge a game, and if it's in the second minute and the guy might be a tenth of an inch offsides, he might not be, it's up to the coach's discretion to say, is it really worth using my challenge right now? Or is it really worth saving it for later? And maybe within the last 10 minutes is when they don't need a coach's challenge and the replay booth or the VAR system would take over. But for me, part of the issue is, and something I learned while researching for this episode, is almost fans now and players, after every single goal, it's like, is that going to be VAR? Like, can I even celebrate? Like, as a fan, like, you're taught, like, players, you're not taught your emotions. A player scores a goal, you jump out of your seat. You're the player who scores the goal. You run, you celebrate, whatever. Now it's, I score a goal. Hold on, let me wait 2 minutes to make sure it doesn't get VAR'd. And while, after hearing what you're saying, I do understand it's the consistency. I think it can be one challenge game, so it's not every single time, but when it is necessary and when the coaches do decide, yep, this is when I need to challenge it, then it is fair.
It can also it can also be strategic, because I know we think of it from an American point of view of like timeouts. Maybe a team, you can see someone's tired, throw a challenge, say they see something, and use it as like a kind of timeout to give everyone a breather.
Yeah.
And you also need limitations then at that point, but that's a whole nother discussion that we can save for another episode. But I want to just touch on one of Will's points where he said, like, if a coach wants to, in soccer, if they want to challenge the first 2 minutes of the game and they think that the guy was offsides and it could result in a PK, soccer's the kind of sport where there's so many 0-0 draws and 1-0 wins that there's so much more strategy, because if you want to use it and get a free PK, let's say, that's such an advantage. Even if it's in the first 2 minutes and you have the 87 minutes left, like, it's huge.
I don't mean to cut you off. I don't think you mean a PK. You wouldn't get awarded a PK for them being offsides. It would more just be...
Depends on the penalty, though. I'm saying, like, if you want to do, like, VAR, like... And it doesn't have to be a PK, but, like, if VAR, like, eventually gets to the point where it's, like, slide tackle...
Or a handball.
Right, okay, I misunderstood. You're right.
Like, because it's a virtual assisted referee. It's, like, for everything. I mean, now they're using it for offsides. I think they started using it for handballs.
Well, they did. I don't know if you guys remember the Chelsea Champions League final. There was a 70 minutes had been played, and they were saying, is it a handball, but it ended up touching the finger, stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think that even if it's like a penalty kick, I mean, we've seen Ronaldo, we've seen Messi, we've seen these guys are so good that they can make these PKs, and it's so big. If you say that it's like 2 minutes and 2 minutes in the game and you go up 1-0, that's so, the amount of momentum is unbelievable that you could gain from that.
And also with professional sports, we're gonna hear about this a lot on this episode. It's a lot about strategy and technology and strategy, and I think this adds another element that's way more exciting.
Yeah, I mean, that's why we're a sports tech podcast.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, all right. Do we think it's time to bring in the expert? I mean, they've heard us talking.
Yeah, I think
the experts.
With that, we're going to bring in our well-respected and honored to have guest, Mr. Kevin Payne. Well, we're honored to have you on the show. We're live right now. Everyone can hear, and I just wanted to give everyone a quick introduction. So I wanted to say, for everyone listening, we at Timeout Tech are privileged today to have with us the CEO of U.S. Club Soccer and former CEO and general manager of DC United, Mr. Kevin Payne. Mr. Payne grew up throughout his life playing soccer all the way through college, and then moving on into his professional career. One of many accomplishments, was able to introduce professional soccer to Washington, D.C., and because we're so excited to have you on, we want to get straight into the questions, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, absolutely. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. You know, this is our inaugural episode. We're excited to get started, and we're honored to have such a great guest for the first one.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Thanks. So to get right into it, is there a moment or action that you would say you're most proud of as a professional soccer executive? And if so, what made this moment so special?
Well, there's a lot of moments. Obviously, winning the first MLS championship, things like that. I will tell you one moment that I've referenced in the past. A lot of what we were trying to do was not just develop a soccer team, but we always had a very broad view of what we were doing. So we understood that we were trying to create a soccer culture in the United States, because one really didn't exist. So one instance that I remember actually revolves around a failure on the field. In 2006, we were 2006, we were the best team in the league. And I think everybody knew that. We won the Supporters' Shield. We went into the playoffs, and everybody expected us to win the MLS Cup again.
Right.
So we were playing the first round against Chicago. We played the first game away in Chicago and I believe we drew 1-1. And then came home, and the expectation was that, that we would win. As it happened, Chicago scored an early goal. One of our best players at the time, Christian Gomez, got red carded.
Right.
We ended up losing. We lost the match 4-0 at home, and that was the end of the season. But at the end of the match, on the far side of the field, the stands never emptied. Everyone remained in place, particularly our supporters clubs. We had 4 different supporters groups. They never left their seats, and they were still waving their giant banners and holding up their signs and messages as though we had just won the game. And
Wow.
I was stunned, because it was the kind of thing you would expect to see at a club that had been around 100 years.
Right.
6. So it was quite a moment. I realized that we actually, in terms of our bigger mission, we had probably succeeded. We had actually developed in Washington, D.C., a culture around professional soccer.
Right. So as you said, you had built that culture, and it was truly starting to grow and emerge.
Yeah, absolutely. We take a lot of pride in the fact that we really kind of established the supporters culture in the U.S. I mean, it's really thriving in a lot of different markets now. But if you were to go back and look at the early years of MLS, it really only existed in D.C.
Right.
There were attempts in other markets, but the clubs themselves, and in many cases the venues, didn't support. Not only did they not support the supporters, but they often actually tried to discourage them. Mostly because they weren't comfortable with the kind of celebrating that they did. They were used to American sports, which are, a little more, I don't know what the word is, regimented, I suppose.
Right.
A little more orderly.
Right.
And, soccer supporters, football supporters tend to be rowdy, but they also are very creative and very independent.
Right.
In the way they support their clubs. So that was something that we felt was very important. And we were fortunate that we had a good ally in the stadium general manager at the time, a guy named Jim Dalrymple, who was not bothered by the fans marching in with, big drums and instruments and giant flags and, banners and so forth. It didn't look like any other American sporting experience in the country.
Mr. Payne, I just want to thank you again for taking the time to speak with us today. But
my pleasure.
the one thing that you just mentioned was creating a soccer culture. And now that MLS is so big and so influential in our society, I was just curious, when trying to create that soccer culture, did you look at like the Premier League, La Liga, and other leagues overseas and try to emulate and replicate that in the States? Or when trying to make it big, was there a totally different marketing strategy behind it?
It's not. No, I certainly look at those, or I have over the years looked at those cultures, particularly for me. Particularly, I looked at places like Argentina and Spain, where the game really is all-encompassing. It's a big deal, obviously, in England, and certainly in places like Germany and France and Italy. The markets that I always really was so impressed by the kind of all-encompassing nature of it were places like Argentina and Spain. I think that the way that those cultures develop players, the way they focus on the experience for all players is really informative and very important for us in a lot of different ways. Partly in terms of developing better players, but also in terms of developing a really, kind of a 360-degree soccer culture.
For sure. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming along. You leave DC United in 2001, you come back in 2004, have an amazing tenure, and then 11 years later, you're inducted into DC United's Hall of Tradition. Tell us about that experience. What did it mean for you and your family being inducted into such a selective group of individuals and such an amazing program?
Yeah, so the one thing that's a little misleading in my bio, I never left DC United. I was responsible for 6 teams as the managing director of soccer for AEG. I was charged with overseeing DC, New York, Chicago, Colorado, LA.
That's quite a handful.
Yeah, San Jose. And it was, so I couldn't be involved in the technical side, the competitive side of any of those clubs. So I was no longer specifically the CEO of DC United, but I still was, my office was still at DC United, and I still was very involved with DC United, but I was also very involved with all of those other teams. So it was a pretty interesting time. Certainly in terms of business, it was a great learning curve for me. It was a period of time in which we essentially transitioned the league from its earliest version, which was infused with a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of naivete, and some really poor discipline. And we began to remake the league as something that was more financially responsible and focused on long-term sustainability. So, the league at that point in time was saved by Phil Anschutz in particular, Lamar Hunt, and the Kraft family. And so when I was inducted into the Hall of Tradition, it was after I had actually left DC United, some years later. That was a great honor for me. We had a number of significant players who were in the Hall of Tradition. I created the Hall of Tradition. I thought it was important that our club celebrate its past and its most important contributors. When we began the team, our first marketing slogan was "The Tradition Begins." And I wanted to ensure that we were always aware of the fact that what we were doing on behalf of posterity. We needed to be aware of the fact that the decisions we made about DC United at any given moment would resonate, down through the years. And so we needed to be self-aware. So, there was a couple of, there were players, obviously, in the Hall of Tradition. There was also a man named Danilo Duran, who was the part of our original Spanish language broadcast team, and just probably loved the club more than anybody else who ever lived. And he had died, unfortunately, died of cancer. And then there was a woman named Betty D'Angelo, who I worked with for years, who had been very involved in our sport on the youth side. She's one of the founders of the U.S. Women's National Team program. She was the operations guru for Soccer USA Partners that I ran in the 90s, and then originally for us at DC United. And, so she was honored as well. So for me, it was an extraordinary honor to join people like John Harkes and Marco Etcheverry and, Richie Williams, but also Betty and Danilo.
Right. Okay, and back with Will now, and kind of pivoting away from what we were talking about with DC United, just to fill you in, prior to calling you on, we had kind of opened the conversation and opened today's episode talking about VAR and the effect it has had on soccer. So, being someone who's been around the game for so long, what were your initial thoughts when VAR was introduced, and do you think that your expectations and how you viewed it has been met?
I have mixed, like a lot of people, I have mixed feelings about VAR. I was very much in favor of goal line technology.
Right.
Because I did believe that there was a simpler sort of objective determination. Was the ball over the line? Was the ball not over the line?
Mr. Payne, can you just explain to the viewers what goal line, technology really is?
Well, yeah, it's a method of determining through technology whether the ball has 100% crossed the line. There have been many instances over the years in soccer where the most famous being the 1966 World Cup final, where there was great doubt about whether the ball went into the goal or not. But we've all seen extraordinary instances where when you watch replays, you realize the ball was clearly in the goal.
You're referencing Germany, England with Wayne Rooney, right?
No, not Wayne Rooney. Wayne Rooney wasn't even born yet. 1966.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was thinking of a different example in my head. I misheard the year, but I myself had recently, in doing some research for this episode, seen an example where, correct me if I'm wrong, I had thought it was a notable Wayne Rooney.
I think it was Frank Lampard, actually, but no, the instance in 1966, the Germans had a shot that pretty clearly went in, but was not counted in. And there have been a lot of instances over the years. I mean, I remember one in a Manchester United game probably 20 years ago where the ball hit the bottom of the crossbar, bounced down, and it was a yard in the goal. But it had a ton of spin on it, and it spun back out, and the linesman couldn't see it for whatever reason, and neither did the referee. So there, that I believe that makes a lot of sense, and I think that because of advances in tennis and other sports, the technology existed that would allow that, and particularly now with AI and stuff where you can create a virtual image that's precise. We saw it in the Spain match against Croatia, where a ball crossed the line. When you watched it live, it was very unclear, but when you saw the technology, it was very obvious. And the call was made very quickly. There was a signal to the referee. I think he actually received a signal somehow on his watch. I'm not sure exactly what that technological approach is. The problem I have with VAR, and I don't like this in American football particularly either. I think that the flow and the rhythm of the game gets interrupted by calls. I've always thought that American football suffered by this whole image it tries to portray, that its calls are 100% precise. So there'll be a play, there'll be a first and, or a 4th and 1 play, and somebody will run the ball into a pile. There'll be 4,000 pounds of players laying on top of the ball, and then they'll precisely spot the ball and measure it and say, oh no, it was short by half an inch. Nonsense.
Yeah, how could you determine that?
Right, and so I always remember Seth Blatter saying something which I thought was really smart. He said years ago, talking about the offside rule, he said, human error is part of the game.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about in our boiler room section. Is VAR too much in the game? Because that's what sports and human nature is, that sense of error.
Well, it's supposed to be correcting clear and obvious errors. I read a quote yesterday by the chief of referees, Rossetti, I think it's Roberto Rossetti for UEFA, who said, there have been 20 calls made that were within 6 and 10 centimeters. And they got them all correct. But, 6 and 10 centimeters is, that's like an inch and a half to, that's very small margins. And I'm not sure that was the intent of the offside rule in the first place. I mean, the offside rule was originally written to prevent really egregious violations, to prevent players from just standing up next to the other team's goal. The idea that now you're going to call a player offside on it might be a really thrilling,
A fingernail.
Connected plays, and the players, literally like an inch on the other side of, or maybe one part of his body is an inch on the other side of the defender, and you're going to call that off, even though he takes a ball that's swung in from 40 yards away and plays it first time into the goal, but you're going to disallow that? I mean, it's just, it's, I think we've lost sight of what the purpose is. I do think that the proposed change in language to say that as long as any part of your body that you can score a goal with is onside, then you're onside. I think that will help. But the other thing that really bothers me is, goals are such dramatic moments in games. Soccer is 90 plus minutes of play, sometimes with no goals.
Right.
Sometimes with one or two. And so that needs to be a moment of enormous pent-up tension released. And instead now, in almost every instance, it leads to this weird moment of suspended anxiety where both sides are just waiting.
Absolutely.
It's...
And it adds too much time to added time in the game, which has always been a little bit of a problem. I just think it's a combination of the manner in which they interpret offside and the overzealousness of the VAR booth instructions.
Right.
Creating problems, in my view.
Yeah, I think you made a lot of great points there, and honestly, almost exactly what we were talking about before you came on. As you said, for me, I think a large part of almost any rule is to prevent a player from gaining an unfair advantage. And to say that someone was offsides by 1/10 of an inch, I'm not really sure that that's a true unfair advantage. And then even further, what you said and researching and learning about fan experience and the way players react to goals, as you said, when a player scores a goal, that they run to the sideline, they celebrate with the fans, or they celebrate with their teammates, or even themselves. The fans celebrate, and now because of this VAR system, as you said, it's kind of like when they score, it's a whole like, hold on, I gotta wait a couple minutes, and it kind of does take away from, as you said, like the release of tension that happens when you finally have that breakthrough.
Yeah, it was. To me, I think it's well intentioned, but probably perhaps not as well
Applied.
applied as it could be. And like I said, I think part of that is the actual language of the offside, not only the rule but the interpretation, which is often more important than the law itself.
Mr. Payne, just such a privilege to hear from you, your expertise. Our listeners are so grateful to hear about both your experiences, how you're such a mogul within the soccer industry, and both your VAR thoughts, because it's definitely a controversial topic, and we're so grateful that you came on today.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
And we look forward to talking to you more in the future.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. It was an honor to have the time to speak with you.
Okie doke. Good luck.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
What an honor that was, getting to talk to such a well-respected individual within the field of soccer. I hope everyone listening at home enjoyed. He brought up many great points. Jake, Andrew, what did you guys think?
Yeah, it was just such an honor to have Kevin on our show today, and I loved his insight. I loved his technology insight, but more like personally, like I loved his like marketing background and what it's like to run a team. Like I thought that was so cool. But the one point of that I want to touch on is that he said something about being clear and concise, and I think that VAR goes a little over the line of it being clear and concise, because you take so much out of the players, you take so much out of the crowd, that if you wanted to check if somebody was offsides after like Ronaldo scored a banger or a knuckleball or
A crazy goal.
Yeah, a crazy goal. I'm blanking out on what it is, but you don't want to take the culture away from the fans.
I think it's important to talk about culture and VAR, but we have to realize VAR is so new. And there's obviously going to be issues at first, and I just personally think right now it's too involved in soccer. Until it's truly, truly finalized and professional, it should be used. But to the sense that, where a finger is determining a goal or a win of offsides or not. Like, that's not what sports is, and that's what Kevin Payne said. He started the organization of the DC United. He has a lot of expertise. He's a soccer mogul. It's really important to understand that VAR should be implemented, but not at the cost of just humanity. And like, we're human. One finger shouldn't decide offsides or not.
And something that I actually thought that he was very interesting and kind of talking about that clear and concise line. How do you draw what is offsides, what's not offsides? How can we be clear and concise? And what I thought was so interesting was what he was saying about the new potential modifications to how we view offsides, is saying offsides is only determined by an area of your body that can score a goal. Mm-hmm. Now, if you can't even use your hand to affect the ball in soccer. So if your fingernail is offsides, what difference does it make? You can't use your hand, so what difference does your fingernail make? Now, if you're talking about your cleat, I honestly do think that kind of makes a difference. While it is a tenth of an inch, maybe if you don't have that tenth of an inch, the defender hits the ball before you, or you don't get there when you do.
It's a foot game. That's
right.
Different.
That's the point. You do use your foot, or if it's your head that's offsides, that could lead to a header. Those tenths of an inches we talk about on all these American sports. These are games of inches. So I kind of went into this episode thinking it was a little ridiculous. What does a centimeter here or there make? And now, after talking to Kevin, I think a centimeter on the foot does make a much bigger difference than the centimeter on the hand. And these new potential ways of interpreting offsides that he mentioned are definitely going to be much more prevalent, or not prevalent, but implementing those new viewpoints are going to definitely help to make this VAR transition and VAR system much more beneficial to the overall sport.
And at the same time, VAR is computerized and programmed. It doesn't know the way humans are thinking, in the sense of, refs. It's kind of fun when the refs, you don't want them to ruin the game, but maybe a ref and the VAR can have a 50% thing. It's not just listen to the VAR. Because, if it's just your finger, just move on. Yep. Don't ruin the game.
I do think, though, that does kind of open up a whole new can of worms of how much is the ref, how much is VAR, how do you draw those lines? It is a whole new can of worms, and I do hear what you're saying.
But what's the point of VAR what's the point of refs when there's VAR? You know what I mean? They're just saying this. Like, they're paid to do more than do that. That's my opinion.
Yeah.
But also, though, it's their job. Like, VAR can't give out yellow cards and red cards. Like, they still have their purpose.
Oh, sure.
We talked a lot about VAR today and VAR in soccer, but let's take the A out of VAR and talk about our startup of the week, a VR soccer company.
What a great introduction that is into our final segment, Startup of the Week. And this week, Startup of the Week is Soccer Dream. For those who don't know, Soccer Dream is a virtual reality soccer training system based out of Barcelona, Spain. Let's give a little clap up for Soccer Dream. And honestly, what a lot of Soccer Dream is focused on is just bringing the fun back to training. For those who want to get involved in more soccer training, utilize Soccer Dream. As you train, it rewards you for your progress, it gives you points, and honestly, as I said, it really just brings the fun back to training. So with that, take care of yourself, take care of others. Peace.